I want to bring Dave in because I know that on the one hand, you and your team designed these incredible processors that allow us to do so much more with so much less, like physically less, right? 7 nanometer now, and do more work. And you know, old days people talk about clock speed, right? Like clock speed's not going up anymore. It's just not that. And yet they're able to do more work. But you probably mostly just get called when people aren't happy, right? The customer, they're not calling saying, wow, we got, 20% more performance with this new machine. Thank you so much. They're calling you if something didn't do what they wanted. And then how do you go through the process of educating them on the things that they can do? Just like in Frank's case, things you can do with understanding your contract, and maybe in your case, things you can do with how you should design your environment.
Yeah. A wise man who's no stranger to a lot of us, one Mr. Handera. The day I met him, incidentally at lunch with Gary King, we were talking about some of this very stuff, and he, I own royalties because I've parroted this back so many times in the time since, but the people that try to save money are the ones that end up spending the most.
Definitely.
I mean, it's such a perfect statement in all domains, and especially Mainframe. And to the question about how do you justify to your organization why to keep performance people on staff, because performance is money. I mean, it's a direct equivalence. Like 99.44% of all the times the red phone on my desk rings, it's not because somebody's not getting their work done. It's because they're paying more for the same work, like maybe after a migration or something. And maybe it's, in many instances, it's usually something trivial, like, just a misconfiguration or whatnot. But, people try to push the limits. They try to get every last, penny out of the hardware. And so they run the boxes north of 95% busy as a matter of standard operating procedure, which is a loser move. People that, tend to shrink, like if your business is holding constant and every generation we put out faster hardware, and if you migrate to it, that means you're reduced to fewer and fewer engines. And eventually you get to a point where you're maybe on a single engine, and now all your work that used to have its own engine is now being swapped out and losing all of its history out of the caches and the branch prediction. It's like, well, maybe you should seriously entertain one of the many subcap offerings that we have, that'll spread that back out. You'll get your vertical high affinity back, and better share of the engines, all things along those lines. I remember my dad telling me a story about, like, when I was a kid, about there was like an opinion piece in a paper that was written by a guy that was hired by banks to go out and reclaim lost money. And his fee for that was he got to keep 10% of whatever he made. And I got to tell you, the thought is not lost on me in this day and age. Like, wow, if I just freelanced and went from client to client, there's so much low-hanging fruit, and I could keep 10% of what I save you. Yeah, I'd be very comfortable.
Can I butt in on the trying to save money thing? Because one of the things I would also say is most of the crit sets I've been involved in have actually, funnily enough, not been about performance. They've been about resilience. And to take David's example of running above 95%, a lot of those have been people sweating the asset to the point that basically their environment is incredibly vulnerable, particularly if they don't set up things like Workload Manager right, or Sysplex right, or stuff like that, which is sort of how I kind of got into resilience as being a companion thing to performance. So I think if people are trying to save money too much, they have to be very careful, and have to be very clever and think very hard about how they're still running what, after all, is a service. Because a service that's out could be very expensive while it's out. It could be more than very expensive while it's out. So I think there's that aspect of running things too hard or designing them poorly that needs to be thought about. And again, look, we have the hard, time-stamped, well-formatted, well understood evidence to be driving those kinds of discussions. If you're going to sail that close to the wind, you really need that kind of insight. So as performance people, we can provide a lot of that. Yeah. And also the other thing I would say as a companion to that is you could optimize for performance, but you need to do it conscious of the environment you're running. Otherwise, you will make mistakes in terms of, let's say, resilience, or mistakes in terms of architecture. You end up butting heads with people who go, well, that's very interesting, but you don't actually understand the ship we're trying to sail here.
Yep. No, I think that, and all this fits well. We got another question, a comment really here. I think there is a happy medium to saving money and spending money for savings. And I think that really speaks to what you guys are talking about. It's just the extremes that are a bad idea. Like we're not saying that business obviously needs to continue to find efficiencies. Well, first of all, that's what we do. Performance by definition, we're trying to find efficiencies all the time. And maybe you don't have a team of 10 performance analysts anymore. Maybe you don't need that. Maybe it's a business model that says you don't need that. But the other extreme is, well, I don't need one at all. I eliminate it, and then you miss fundamental things. As Dave said, you could go around and make a pretty good living with low-hanging fruit, whereas if you kept a handful of them on staff, they're going to catch that low-hanging fruit every time. You're going to save a bunch of money in the long run. It's always difficult to quantify something that didn't happen. My boss, that same Bruce McKenzie, used to say to me, we're at our best when nobody knows who we are, when we're invisible and everything is just humming right along. And some of the analysts might come around, business analysts, and say, so what do you do exactly? You seem to just be sitting here looking at these monitors. We're not seeing you produce code every day, or go to a bunch of meetings. I'm like, well, are things running well? Yeah. Okay. Well, then we're doing our jobs, I guess. I'd think of that same thing in the extreme. Dave, you mentioned running at 100% busy. In the bad old days, we used to think, oh, a busy CPU is a happy CPU. I've heard that one before. And there is certainly an argument, which I think is a fair argument, that System Z runs better than other platforms at higher utilization. But that doesn't mean that you should be binary about that. Well, let's run at 100%. It's still not a good idea, right?
Well, to what Martin was saying about resilience, I mean, you don't insulate yourself from surges and anything unexpected, and you can pay a premium for OOCOD. I mean, we have ways to make it work for you, but
pay for that.
If you bought maybe a little more hardware and ran a little more comfortably, you would realize some of the efficiency savings from doing that, and you insulate yourself against the peaks. Another favorite one I hear with some frequency is like clients that still run on COBOL 4.2 because they fired all the compiler people that would test out the applications and then promote them to production. And well, they ran before, just fine. We'll continue running with them. It's like, well, no, I mean, you're forgoing 20 plus years of architecture refinements and efficiency enhancements. And I use the old 70s leaded gas. You can't put 70s gas in a Prius today. The car will choke itself out. It's the same way with these processors. They are far less tolerant of garbage and inefficient code, and even 20-year ago compiler code. It's in order to make do at the end of Moore's law. We're turning over every last stone, and I conjured in one of my processor presentations from a while ago, Spock from Wrath of Khan. At the end, when he famously says, when he sacrifices himself, that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one. And so, to that end, we optimize for the general case, for the common case. And so if you're operating in the fringe case that may have been tolerated before, you're living on borrowed time. I mean, the fringes are very quickly becoming more extreme on every generation. And so, yeah, it pays to keep a compiler guy on staff, and pay him, 200,000 a year or whatever to do, the testing and the promotion, because he could be saving you $1 million a year. I mean, it's a no-brainer. But yeah, everybody loves to save money and cut staff. So.
And that does raise the point, doesn't it? That I think we're in a position where we can strongly influence the priorities of an organization and the program of work going forward. And that would be a classic one, which is you've got to make jolly sure you can actually take advantage of latest compilers, and should regard that as a reasonable priority to do so. And we can say something like, it will have a big impact, or it will only have a small impact, which is one of the ways we actually do influence what an organization's agenda actually is.
Yeah, or even to take it to another level, a lot of the older shops used to have assembly coders on hand, that custom wrote stuff that was very efficient. And the rules about what makes a piece of code efficient varies and evolves over time as the hardware evolves over time. And so if you don't keep that talent on hand to maintain and make those adjustments over time, I mean, you lose those efficiencies, and now you're paying through the nose for that. And that's a far more specialized talent than a compiler person. I mean, having somebody on staff who still knows Z assembler and can maintain your code is a rare bird. And they retire and they don't backfill them, and it ends up costing the company money. So